June 28, 1942, Army Group South Headquarters, near Poltava, Ukraine. Rain from the night still clung to the grass outside the low command huts, turning the earth into a dark paste that sucked at boots and dulled the sound of footsteps. Inside, the air was dry and hot, thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of sweat-soaked uniforms. A single electric bulb buzzed softly over the operations table, where colored pins crawled eastward across a vast, creased map of southern Russia. Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss stood at the edge of that map, cap tucked under his arm, eyes fixed on a blue line that ran north to south like a vein. The Volga. Next to it, just another name in block letters, sat a word that meant little to most of the men in the room. Stalingrad. He heard the scratch of a pen, the murmur of staff officers checking times, divisions, fuel consumption. A clock on the wall showed Arrow 3:42. In less than 2 hours, the opening artillery preparations would start. Case Blue. Fall Blau. The words had been whispered through corridors and over encrypted radio for weeks. But today, they were no longer a plan. Today, they were movement, fire, and steel. At the far end of the table, General Oberst Friedrich Paulus leaned over the map, one hand on its edge to steady the paper, the other holding a pencil like a dagger. Beside him, staff officers rattled off reports. Panzer divisions fueling near Kharkov, infantry corps forming up along the Donets, Luftwaffe assets ready at forward airfields. "You see, Herr General," a staff colonel said quietly, tapping a shaded zone to the south, "once we break through here, nothing stands between us and the Caucasus. Baku, Maikop, Grozny. The Russians will run out of fuel, their tanks, their planes, all of it. It ends there." Weiss listened, but his eyes drifted back to the word on the Volga, Stalingrad. The colonel had skipped over it entirely, his finger jumping from the Don Bend southward to the Caucasus. To these men, it was a waypoint, a river crossing, a supply node. Nothing more. A door opened behind him, letting in a gust of cool air and the distant rumble of trucks. A young signals officer stepped in, clutching a folder. Message from Führer headquarters. "Herr Generaloberst," he said, trying not to cough in the smoke. Paulus took the folder, flipped it open, and read in silence. The room hushed. Weiss could almost feel every pair of eyes shift toward the general. After a moment, Paulus spoke, voice controlled, almost flat. "The primary objective remains the seizure of the Caucasus oil fields," he said. "Priority emphasis is placed on securing the southern axis. At the same time, the Führer stresses the political importance of Stalingrad. The city is to be denied to the enemy. Its capture would have great moral and symbolic value. Symbolic value." The words hung in the air. Weiss felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. Oil was logic. Rail lines and rivers were logic. Symbols were something else. He glanced at the map again. If you were standing where you are now, watching from the edge of that table, you might feel it too, that subtle shift from clear military objective into something more dangerous. Outside, engines coughed to life. Somewhere out beyond the staff huts, Panzer III and IV crews were climbing into cramped steel hulls, checking breech blocks, slapping mud off their boots. Drivers leaned over open engine bays that smelled of fuel and hot oil. Artillery gun commanders checked elevation screws and laid out stacked rows of shells, their metal casings beading with morning damp. In a makeshift field chapel, a chaplain spoke over a line of soldiers, his words almost lost under the rising growl of machinery. A few men crossed themselves quickly, others stared past him, eyes on the eastern horizon where the sky was just beginning to pale. Back inside, Paulus straightened, set the paper down, and looked at his staff. "Gentlemen," he said, "Case Blue begins now." Weiss did not salute. There was no command given for it. Instead, men simply moved, pens scratched, telephones were lifted, radio operators bent over headsets, sending the coded words that would set nearly 1 million men in motion. On the map, pins did not move, but in the fields and forests beyond this quiet room, engines roared and tracks began to roll toward rivers, step and names on paper that would soon be written in blood. Weiss glanced one last time at the Volga, at that one city the colonel's finger had skipped. Stalingrad. Just letters on a page. For now. June 28th, 1942, east of Kharkov, along the Donets River. Dawn came as a pale smear behind low clouds, turning the river into a strip of dull metal. On the western bank, German artillery batteries crouched like dark insects along the tree line. Men moved between the guns with practiced speed, ramming shells home, adjusting elevation wheels that squeaked softly in the damp air. Lieutenant Hans Kruger wiped his palms on his tunic and glanced at his watch. 4:29. He could feel his heart beating faster than the second hand. Around him, his gun crew waited. Eyes on him, ears half-tuned to the chatter on the field telephone line that ran back to the regimental command post. "Stand by," he called, more to steady himself than them. Behind the guns, panzer regiments were forming up, rows of steel silhouettes that loomed out of the mist. Engines idled, coughing and growling. The smell of exhaust and fuel lay heavy over the riverbank. Men climbed up onto hulls, securing bedrolls, extra fuel cans, crates of ammunition. Tank commanders stood in open hatches, goggles already around their necks, scanning the eastern shore where Soviet positions lay quiet. Too quiet. The phone on Kruger's post crackled. A voice, clipped and formal, cut through the static. "Battery. Fire mission. Case Blue begins. Targets. Opposite bank. Suppression. Fire when ready." Kruger drew a breath. "Battery. Load high explosive. Elevation is set. On my command." Steel slid against steel as shells were heaved into open breaches. The last mist was lifting now, revealing the east bank as a dark line crowned with low earthworks, scattered bunkers, and the faint glint of wire. Somewhere over there, Soviet infantry waited in their own silence, some smoking, some praying, some staring west with tired, hollow eyes. "Battery!" Kruger raised his hand, then chopped it down. Fire. The world detonated. Guns barked in stuttering unison, each blast a physical blow that punched at chests and rattled teeth. Flames spat from muzzles, rolling back in orange tongues before disappearing in the gray light. Empty shell casings clanged against the wooden duckboards as loaders moved with mechanical urgency. Across the river, the first impacts blossomed into fountains of dirt, smoke, and shattered timber. In a foxhole on the eastern bank, Red Army soldier Ivan Petrov flinched as the first shells struck behind the lines. Then in front of them, then directly among the trenches. The air filled with a roar that swallowed every other sound. Earth cascaded into the hole, peppering his face, his hands. Someone screamed nearby, a thin rising note that vanished under the next salvo. He dragged his helmet lower over his brow, clutching his rifle to his chest. Orders had been clear. Hold the river. Hold until reinforcements arrived. Hold because this was the gate to the south, to the Don, to the vast spaces behind. But the orders had not mentioned what to do when the sky itself seemed to be falling. Back on the western bank, the barrage climbed in pitch, rolling along the Soviet line like a giant hand sweeping across a table. Overhead, the first Stukas appeared, black crosses on pale wings. Sirens under their noses began to howl as they tipped into their dives, sound knifing through the artillery thunder, designed to dig into nerves and twist. Bombs fell along the far bank, sending up plumes of smoke that joined the growing curtain over the river. Through that murk, the panzers began to move. Hans Kruger watched as the tanks clanked past his battery position, one after another, tracks grinding through the churned mud. A commander in a turret waved 2 fingers in a quick, almost casual salute. The barrels of the main guns pointed east, steady as they rolled toward the crossing points where engineers had thrown pontoon bridges over the Donets during the night. Over the next hours, the German advance pressed eastward like a tidal surge. Soviet positions that held were bypassed where possible, marked on maps for follow-up infantry. Villages along dusty roads saw gray columns roar through, engines roaring, dust boiling up in great clouds that coated leaves and faces. Behind the spearheads came fuel trucks, field kitchens, medical units, miles of support that kept the armored tip sharp. On maps far behind the front, staff officers pushed pins forward, first across the Donets, then toward the Don Bend, toward cities whose names still meant only movement and logistics. Voronezh, Rostov, far away, hardly noticed at this stage. Stalingrad sat on the Volga, its small marker unchanged. For now, no one in those first hours thought of it as anything more than one more point along a long blue river, but the road was being laid, kilometer by kilometer, river by river, in smoke and soot. July 10th, 1942, near Voronezh, west bank of the Don River. Heat lay on the steppe like a hand pressing everything down. The sky was a hard, colorless blue, and the air shimmered above the dusty road where Lieutenant Hans Kruger's Panzerthrur rattled forward in a long column of armor and trucks. Dust billowed in thick brown clouds behind each vehicle, coating faces, goggles, and the few scrub bushes that managed to cling to the roadside. Inside the tank, the air stank of oil, sweat, and hot metal. The engine roared at his back, a constant grinding thunder that vibrated through his spine. Kruger stood half out of the turret, goggles on, headset clamped over his cap, scanning the horizon. Fields of ripening grain rolled away on both sides, broken only by solitary trees and the occasional low rise. Somewhere beyond the haze lay the Don. Ahead, signal flags snapped from the lead tank. The column slowed. Kruger raised a hand and repeated the gesture. Tracks squealed as they bit into the hard ground. The tank lurched to a halt. His gunner swore softly. On the roadside, a burning Soviet truck sent a greasy column of smoke into the sky. A few bodies lay scattered nearby, dark shapes in dusty tunics. The fight here had been brief. The Red Army rearguard had thrown up a line, fired, then melted away, leaving wreckage and a few dead to mark their passing. It had been like this for days. Contact, fire, then sudden emptiness, as if the defenders were shadows pulling back faster than the Germans could close. Kruger lifted his goggles, wincing as dust rubbed raw skin around his eyes. He spotted a signpost at a crossroads, its wooden arm splintered by shrapnel. One direction still readable, Voronezh. The other, pointing south, had been blasted away. A motorcycle messenger roared up, skidding to a stop beside the tank. The rider swung off, yanked off his helmet, and shouted up, "New orders. Herr Leutnant, the division holds here while the infantry closes up. Then we pivot south, toward the Don Bend." "Not east," Kruger called. "East is for others now." The rider answered, shrugging. "We go south, toward Rostov, toward the Caucasus. Oil." He spat the last word like it was something solid he could throw away. Far to the rear, at Army Group South headquarters, Oberst-Leutnant Karl Weiss stood once again at the operations map. The colors had changed since June. The front line bulged far into Soviet territory now, curving around the great bend of the Don. Voronezh, once deep in the map, now sat near the front pins. Rostov to the south had fresh markings around it, arrows and dates, Paulus stood with other senior officers as a liaison from Führer headquarters finished reading the latest directive. Army Group South is to be reorganized. The liaison said, Army Group A will drive into the Caucasus and seize the oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and beyond. Army Group B will move along the Don and advance toward the Volga. Particular emphasis is placed on the capture of Stalingrad. His finger traced the new pattern on the map. One great arrow south, another striking east toward that same blue line and that same city Weiss had stared at weeks ago. Stalingrad again, one staff colonel muttered under his breath. The Führer cannot leave that name alone. Weiss said nothing. But he felt the shift. Before, Stalingrad had been a waypoint, a river crossing. Now it was underlined in red pencil, circled twice. Oil remained the official prize. But the tone of the directive was different whenever the city was mentioned. Political importance, symbolic value, a city carrying the name of Stalin himself. To deny it to the Soviets would be a blow Hitler clearly wanted. Paulus cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said, "our task is now twofold. Army Group A will push to the Caucasus. We, with Army Group B, will secure the Don, then advance on Stalingrad and the Volga. Our timetable is tight. The Russians are retreating in disorder, but they are not broken." On the eastern side of the steppe, Ivan Petrov shuffled in a column of Red Army soldiers moving eastward, away from the Don, away from Voronezh. Their boots raised little puffs of dust as they marched. A political officer rode alongside on a horse that looked as tired as the men, shouting slogans about trading space for time, about drawing the fascists deeper into the land. Fields and villages they passed were burned or already stripped. Scorched earth. Orders from above. Leave nothing the enemy can use. Wells were fouled. Grain stores destroyed. Carts that could not be moved were smashed. The land itself seemed wounded, at a crossroads. Petrov glanced up at a distant railway bridge. A few days earlier, trains had still rattled over it, carrying tanks and guns east. Now it stood silent against the sky. Its central span collapsed in a twisted heap of steel. Someone ahead pointed eastward, where the sun was already hot and merciless. "Volga," a soldier muttered. "They say we fall back to the Volga, to Stalingrad." The name passed through the column in low voices. Some had never heard of it. Others had uncles or cousins who had once worked in its factories. To the men trudging east, it was just another city, another place to defend, another line to hold. But somewhere far behind, at a map table lit by a buzzing bulb, red pencil marks were turning that same name into a prize both sides would bleed for. Late July 1942, west of Rostov, on the road to the Caucasus. The heat had turned from burden to punishment. The steppe no longer looked golden from a distance. Up close, it was brittle and gray. Every blade of grass coated in dust. Flies clustered on everything that moved and most things that did not. Lieutenant Hans Kruger leaned out of his turret, wiping dry sweat from his neck. His Panzer III sat engine off in a long column baking in the sun. To the south, the faint outline of low hills shimmered. In the roadside ditch, infantry lounged in the meager shade of their own helmets, tunics unbuttoned, faces slack with exhaustion. A truck rumbled past, piled high with fuel drums lashed together by frayed rope. Another followed, loaded with shells. A third carried men from a mountain division, ropes and pitons hanging from their packs, wool uniforms dark with sweat. They looked at the panzers with the mild curiosity of men who would soon be climbing where tracks could not go. The battalion commander's half-track rolled slowly along the column. A loudspeaker crackled. "Attention, orders from Corps. Our division is assigned to Army Group A. We move through Rostov, then into the Caucasus. The oil fields are our objective." The voice paused. letting the words hang in the still air. Then, almost as an afterthought, other formations will advance to the Volga, toward Stalingrad. Stalingrad again. The name barely registered for Hans. Oil made sense. Fuel was what kept the engine behind his back alive, what kept the panzers moving. Take the oil and the Russians would starve on the ground. Their tanks stranded. The logic was simple enough to cling to, but logic did not cool the air or fill the fuel cans fast enough. Days blurred into a pattern of advance. Halt, wait for supply, advance again. Bridges had been blown over every stream worth the name. Engineers sweated over pontoons while Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes droned overhead, their shadows sliding over the waiting tanks like lazy birds. At Rostov, the smell of the sea mingled with smoke and rot. The city had already changed hands once in the winter. Now it burned in places again, wrecked trams lying on their sides, windows blown out of stone buildings. Columns of prisoners shuffled through the streets. Heads down, watched by guards too tired even to jeer. Hans's tank crossed the Don at Rostov on a pontoon bridge that flexed and shuddered with every passing vehicle. He stood in the open hatch and watched the river sliding beneath them, thick and brown, full of drifting debris. East bank, southward turn. Another road, another horizon. The map in his mind showed mountains ahead now. Not rivers, far to the north, along that same vast front. Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss traced a different path with his fingertip on the operations map at Army Group B headquarters. The huge arrow for Army Group A now curved deep into the Caucasus, into names like Maikop and Grozny. Beside it, a second arrow hugged the Don north of Rostov, then swung east toward a city on the Volga, Stalingrad. Fuel consumption figures lay scattered around the map like fallen leaves. Supply columns stretched for hundreds of kilometers back to railheads that were themselves strained to breaking. Each new advance meant another length of road to patrol, another bridge to guard, another village to garrison. A logistics officer, collar damp with sweat, jabbed at a sheet of paper. If we push both axes at this tempo, our fuel margin becomes razor thin within weeks. Army Group A and B are both dependent on the same rail lines. Every train south is a train not going east. Weiss listened while Paulus studied the documents in silence. The general's face was expressionless, but Weiss saw the way his jaw tightened. "The Führer is clear," Paulus said at last. "The oil fields are vital, and Stalingrad must be taken. We do not choose between them." No one in the room said what they were all thinking, that the distance, the heat, and the wrecked railways might make that choice for them. Eastward. Ivan Petrov's world had narrowed to the rhythm of boots and the weight of his rifle. The retreat felt endless. Their regiment fell back through villages emptied in haste, where the only inhabitants were burned fences, smashed wellheads, and the occasional dog slinking between ruined sheds. At a junction near a wide, dusty road, fresh troops from the east passed them moving the other way. New uniforms, cleaner faces, factory smell still clinging to them instead of smoke. A captain from staff rode up, his map case slapping against his saddle. "You," he barked at a group that included Ivan, "you are reassignments now. You go to Stalingrad. The city needs men. You will dig. You will build. You will fight there." Stalingrad. The name that had passed down the column in mutters now came with weight. A place to stop, perhaps. A place to turn and face west again instead of always walking away. That evening, as the sun bled out over the flat land, the sky glowed orange in the far distance, where something burned beyond the horizon. No one knew if it was an oil depot, a village, a town. The war was starting to look the same no matter where you stood, smoke on the edge of sight, heat at your back, orders pointing you onward. In headquarters, tents and cramped tank turrets. On dusty roads and river banks, the fork in the road had been taken. One spear thrust south, chasing oil in the mountains. The other groped its way toward a city on the Volga that was still, for most of the men marching and riding toward it, only a name and a promise that here, finally, they would stand and fight. Early August 1942, along the Don Bend, west of Kalash, the steppe had taken on a dusty, exhausted look, the tall grass beaten down into rippled waves by weeks of marching boots and rolling tracks. The sun hung white in a colorless sky, turning every metal surface into a sheet of glare. Lieutenant Hans Kruger's Panzer III crawled forward in low gear, part of a column that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery, fuel trucks, ambulances. The road was choked with them, a steel river flowing east. Then, without warning, the river stopped. Hans cursed softly into his headset as the tank lurched to a halt. Ahead, engines idled angrily, exhaust fumes mingling with dust to form a bitter curtain that stung the eyes. He climbed halfway out of the turret and looked along the line. Vehicles stood nose to tail, some at odd angles where drivers had tried to edge past only to be blocked in turn. A runner trotted down the road between stalled vehicles, pausing to shout up at each tank commander, "Change of orders. 4th Panzer Army reorients north. Objective Stalingrad region. Priority to reach the Volga and cut enemy traffic. Make room on the road. We move now." Hans frowned. "I thought we were pushing south, toward the Caucasus." The runner shrugged. "Ask the generals. All I know is the name they keep repeating." He lifted his hand and jabbed it eastward. Stalingrad. The city was no longer an afterthought. It was the word that shaped movement. Divisions that had been bound for the mountains were being turned, redirected toward the great bend in the Don where the road to the Volga began. Maps in command tents, rewritten in a pencil, then written again. Every adjustment meant columns like this one grinding to a halt, then lurching forward in new directions, burning fuel and time in clouds of dust. Far to the rear, in a stuffy headquarters near Milerovo, Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss stood at the familiar map table. The arrows were thicker now, lines upon lines as the offensive fanned out. Army Group A struck deeper into the Caucasus, its spearheads already sniffing around my cup. Army Group B curved along the Don, closing a great hook around the city on the Volga. Paulus listened in rigid silence as another directive from Führer headquarters was read aloud. The capture of Stalingrad is of decisive importance. The enemy must be denied this vital industrial and traffic center. Its fall will break the morale of the Soviet people and disrupt all traffic on the Volga. Weiss studied the red circle around the city. Rail lines converged there. Factories lined the riverbank. The Volga itself was a vertical highway on the map, carrying barges full of men and material from the north and south into the heart of the Soviet war machine. Cut that, and you might indeed strangle something vital. But his eyes were drawn to the long, thin lines that fed the German advance. Single-track railways pushed forward as fast as engineers could repair them. Every kilometer east meant another bridge to protect, another siding to build, another bridgehead to supply. Across the Don, we are thin. Herr Generaloberst. Weiss said quietly when the reading ended, "If the Russians choose to stand and fight for this city, we will have to feed more and more formations into a narrow frontage. Our flanks grow longer every day." Paulus did not answer at once. The only sound for a moment was the faint buzz of the lamp and the scratch of a clerk's pen. "The Führer believes the Russians are finished in this sector," he said at last. "He believes they will not recover from the defeats of this summer. Stalingrad is to be taken quickly. There will be no prolonged fighting." Weiss thought of the reports on his desk. Soviet units shattered, yes, but not dissolved, retreating in battered columns, regrouping across the Don, digging in around the approaches to the Volga, not finished, not yet, on the other side of that wide, lazy river. Ivan Petrov stood in a trench that was still raw earth. its sides crumbling, its floor cluttered with shovels and empty ammunition crates. The sun beat down on his helmet. His shirt clung to his back. Behind him, the city rose in a haze of heat. Stalingrad. Smokestacks from tractor and tank factories pierced the sky. Rows of tenement blocks stood in long lines. Cranes leaned over the river docks, where barges came and went in an almost constant procession. Trucks rattled through the streets, horns blaring at slow-moving columns of workers and soldiers. From the ridge where his trench ran, Ivan could see the Volga shining broad and brown. Air raid sirens wailed occasionally now, long, mournful cries that made dogs bark and children stiffen. The Luftwaffe had begun to visit more often. At first, only reconnaissance planes. Lately, Heinkel bombers and Stukas that left black smears of smoke on the skyline. The men in Ivan's unit called the city many things: a fortress, a trap, a last chance. Officers told them it was a shield, a wall between the invader and the deep interior of the country. Political officers pointed at the name on lapel badges and factory gates. This was the city of Stalin. To lose it would be unthinkable. That night, as a warm wind blew across the trenches, Ivan sat with his back to the dirt wall and listened to distant rumbling. Not thunder, the steady, low growl of artillery far to the west, on the other side of the Don. The front was moving closer. On a tank deck many kilometers away, Hans lay on his blanket and stared up at a sky full of stars. Somewhere ahead, past the black line of the river, past the low roll of the land, a city waited by the Volga. He did not know its streets or its factories, its workers or its soldiers. He knew only its name, repeated in orders and rumors until it had taken on a weight far beyond its place on the map. Stalingrad, August 23rd, 1942. Sky over Stalingrad. The first sirens began at 16:90, a wavering cry that slid along the rooftops and factory chimneys, making birds explode from their perches. Ivan Petrov dropped the crate he was carrying on the tractor factory loading dock and looked up. The sky was a washed-out blue, innocent at a glance. Then he saw them. Dots. Dozens of them at first, then more. Black specks that grew slowly, almost lazily, until he could make out wings. 3 engines, boxy fuselages, silver flashes in the sun as they banked. Heinkels. At their sides, the dagger shapes of escort fighters. People poured into the yard, shading their eyes with hands already blackened by grease and soot. A woman with a red kerchief clutched a child to her hip. A foreman shouted at everyone to get to the shelters, his voice already lost under the rising scream of air raid sirens. The first bombs fell on the northern districts. Ivan saw it as a distant flicker, like someone striking matches along the horizon, followed by a line of tall, dark flowers blooming into the sky. Then the sound arrived, a rolling crash that seemed to tear at the air itself. Windows rattled in their frames. Somewhere nearby, glass exploded outward. He ran, down the stairs, through a corridor already crowded with workers, into a shelter that smelled of damp concrete, sweat, and fear. The door slammed behind him. The world narrowed to the flicker of a single bulb and the thud of hearts beating too fast. Above them, the city began to burn. Across the Don, west of Stalingrad, the same sky glowed differently. Lieutenant Hans Kruger stood on the turret of his Panzer III, goggles pushed up on his helmet, and watched the eastern horizon. Streaks of smoke clawed their way upward where the first waves of bombers had struck. The setting sun turned the smoke red from below, as if the ground itself were on fire. The Don shimmered near at hand, wide and slow, its banks lined with willows and scrub. Pontoon bridges lay across it now, fat and low, sagging under the weight of vehicles. The air was a constant growl of engines, a chorus of shouts, clanking tracks, and orders. Hans listened to the briefing one more time. "We drive through Kalach at first light," the battalion commander said, pointing at a map spread over the hood of a truck. "We break the remaining enemy defenses west of the city, secure the bridgeheads, then thrust directly into the northern suburbs. The Volga must be reached. The enemy river traffic is to be cut. The city will fall in days." In the background, the sky over Stalingrad pulsed, brighter with each passing minute. Far behind, in a cramped headquarters, Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss stood at his usual place beside the operations map. The light from the lamp above was yellow and harsh. The pins around Stalingrad were thick now, crowded together like bristles on a brush. Arrows converged on the city from northwest and southwest. Reports lay open on the table. Fuel shortages, divisions that were down to half strength. Flanks along the Don held by units stretched far beyond their intended frontage, backed by Romanian and Italian forces of uncertain quality. Paulus traced a finger along the front line, stopping at the city. "Once we take this," he said, "the Volga is cut. The enemy loses his artery. Army Group A will have its oil. The war in the east will turn." Weiss did not argue. It was not his place, but he saw how the vast ambition of Case Blue, the sweeping plan to seize the whole South, had narrowed into this one burning point on the map. Oil fields that had seemed within reach were now starved of attention and supply. The great summer offensive, launched to grab resources, had funneled its strength into streets and factories still untouched by German boots. In the shelter beneath the tractor factory, the air turned hot and sour. Dust sifted down from the ceiling with every impact. Children cried until their voices broke. Someone began to sing a song from before the war, thin and shaking. When the door finally opened again, the light that spilled in was orange, not the clean white of day. Ivan climbed out and saw that the world had changed. Blocks of workers' housing were on fire, flames pouring from windows like flags. The riverfront cranes stood outlined against a curtain of smoke. Warehouses burned in long, low lines. Their roofs collapsed. Somewhere in the distance, a fuel depot had been hit, sending a tall pillar of black smoke into the sky. Yet the docks still moved. Barges hugged the near bank, unloading crates, guns, and men even as bombs fell further upriver. Trucks rattled away from the quays, their drivers hunched over wheels, faces streaked with soot. A political officer stood on a pile of rubble, waving a pistol in the air as if it were a flag. "Comrades," he shouted, voice cracking but loud enough to carry, "this is our city. We will hold the Volga. We will hold Stalingrad. There is nowhere left to retreat." Ivan looked at the burning streets and believed him, not because of the slogans, but because behind him there was only the broad brown river, and beyond that, more smoke and the endless east. On his tank turret, Hans watched the glow on the horizon and listened to the distant thunder that never stopped. He did not know it, but the road that had begun weeks earlier at a quiet map table near Poltava had brought him to the edge of a new kind of battle. Case Blue. The grand summer offensive aimed at oil and victory had carried the German army to the gates of Stalingrad. Ahead lay ruins, street by street fighting, and a struggle that would consume the plans laid on any map.